Okay, so particularly, as you can hear there, feisty question period here in Ottawa as members of Parliament kick off their final sitting week of 2023, coming off nearly 30 hours of marathon voting last week, prompted by a Conservative filibuster. What kind of stage is being set for these final sitting days, and what does it tell us about party strategy heading into the holiday break? Let's bring back the front bench: Dan Moulton, Shakir Chambers, Kathleen Monk, and Laura Stone. Laura, I'll start with you. What do you read into that exchange?
Oh, seems like a good use of everyone's time this afternoon. No, look, I mean, the focus is clearly turning to the front runner, right? The front runner. The Conservatives have been leading in the polls for quite some time now. We're going into a year before an anticipated election. And so things are getting real here. I think that's what's happening. And we're seeing, I think, finally the Liberals fighting back. And I say finally because I think we've sensed the frustration in the caucus. We've seen the pushback against Justin Trudeau from within his own party, wondering when the Liberals are going to start responding and taking on Pierre Poilievre. And I think that's what Canadians are finally seeing now. Whether it's too late, whether it's going to punch through, whether people are just too tired of Trudeau to give him another chance. I mean, that remains to be seen. But clearly the focus now is going to be on what kind of government will Pierre Poilievre run? Because this is a very real possibility now. We're seeing the Liberal strategy here, obviously bringing in, this talk of far-right politics, bringing in Republicans, bringing in American-style politics. We're going to hear this again and again because things are getting real. And the prospect of a Pierre Poilievre government is happening. And so we are going to see, I think, both the Liberals and the NDP try to really paint a frightening picture of what they think that would look like for people.
Yeah, I think that's really good analysis. I think the questions that Laura raises, Kathleen, are all valid ones. We don't know if it'll work. We don't know if it's too late. But you can definitely notice that there's some coalescing of message on the Liberals' part for the first time in months and months.
They've got some energy. I don't know if they see some weakness. I think really the strategic blunder that the Conservatives made was 2 weeks ago approximately when they first voted against the Ukraine trade deal. And then the Liberals almost woke up and said, wow, when we have a proof point like this, when they vote against something that is so important to Canadians, we can use that in our messaging. And then they continue to use that time and time again, whether it was with the comments around the terrorist attack or most substantively, frankly, when we had this filibuster in the House or the antics in the House, where they now have a full list of the things that the Conservatives have voted against. And they're going to hammer him with that time and time again, whether you heard it in that clip that you played off the top. You voted against housing for veterans. You voted against women's shelters. These are going to be, or national food programs for children and students in school. These things are going to be damning against the Conservatives. And finally, it's given the Liberals a bit of a lift and the Democrats a lift to paint a picture of Poilievre.
Shakir, what's the strategy, do you think, for the Conservatives? Because I think they would have anticipated, for example, that the Liberals would have come back at them with all the things they voted against. So what's the calculation they made that it was worth it?
I think on the Ukraine piece, and I do think it was a misstep, but they're so adamant against carbon pricing and the carbon tax that at any point when they see it, they're going to vote against it. I think on Ukraine, I would agree with Kathleen. That was a big misstep by the party, and now they're being attacked on it. But I think even just for the Liberals, I think ultimately it was before the Ukraine trade deal. I mean, over the last 4 or 5 weeks, every time they have a press conference, every time they have an interview, they're making sure they get in lines about the Conservatives being risky, the Conservatives rolling back certain policies, and they're on the offensive, which is very great. I think it'd be beneficial if they had some money to put some ad campaigns behind some of the things they're saying or some of the votes the Conservatives actually voted against. That would help their cause. But they definitely have some more fire. They're definitely on the offensive. And to be quite frank, I mean, if you do look at their polling numbers, they have nothing to lose. So they should be going on the offensive at every opportunity they get. But I do think the Conservatives have made some missteps. And at the end of the day, I think Pierre Poilievre and his team, they often run up against the line very, very closely, right? They often even cross the line sometimes. So I think the Liberals and NDP will have opportunities to kind of seize on certain things. We just got to see if it connects with Canadians, right? We show these clips of questioning period, but let's be frank with each other. Canadians don't watch questioning period. So what other channels are the Liberals and the NDP going on to kind of get that message out, to kind of dent the Pierre brand and bring his polling down a little bit?
That's a really good question. And I'm wondering, from a strategic point of view, Dan, where you see the Liberals taking this kind of coalescing again of criticism or argument, whatever you want to call it, to a different audience?
Yeah, well, I think it's, I just reframe and say, I think it's discipline and message, right? I think that's what we've seen from the government the last 3 weeks is a lot more discipline in a consistent communications narrative that puts the Conservatives on their back heels a little bit and tries to communicate more actively what the government is doing to improve the lives of everyday Canadians and make life a bit more affordable. That doesn't happen overnight. You don't see polls turn around overnight. It's going to take a long time and a lot of continued discipline over the long term in order to start to see things shift around. I agree with Shakir. I think some advertising is overdue. I understand the calculus of the campaign and the Prime Minister's office, which is if we spend all this money right now attacking Pierre Poilievre or trying to define him, will it have the desired impact we want it to have this far out from an election? Would we be better served to wait a little bit closer, to see the dynamics of global politics and see where things play out? Certainly a second Donald Trump presidency, which looks more and more likely if you look at some of the polls south of the border, provides a convenient foil in the spring as the Republican primaries are underway and he's looking more and more like he's going to for sure be the nominee and be positioned to win the U.S. presidential election in a year's time. That presents a really convenient foil for the government to use. I think if they're disciplined in their message and they're able to tie the rise of a Republican Trump movement in the States again to Pierre Poilievre, that would be a more convenient political dynamic for them than anything else.
On that latter question, Laura, it's going to be really interesting because you pointed out earlier, right, frequently over the past 2 weeks, all of a sudden we're hearing the word MAGA in the House of Commons all the time. Do you think that will be effective ultimately?
I think it's too early to say. I mean, this is clearly the road that the Liberals are going down. I think they view this as an opportunity. And, they've always kind of tried to do this. I think, we saw it during Andrew Scheer's time in leadership, maybe not so much with Erin O'Toole, but somewhat with, gun policies and things like that. So, clearly the Liberals do view this as an opportunity. And they probably also think too, that the Conservatives may have peaked too early. I think that's always kind of been the challenge for Pierre Poilievre, is that he's been riding so high in the polls this year with still a year left, and so much can happen in a year, both within Canada, but in world events as well. And so, that will be the challenge for the Conservatives. Can they keep this momentum going? The Liberals have a bit more time and a bit more leeway and control if they continue to work well alongside the NDP of when this election will eventually be called.
Shakir, how do you think the Conservatives, they've got to know at this point that it's going to be invoked all the time, that comparison. How do you think they are thinking about countering it?
To be frank, I'm not sure it works. Like Laura said, it was used against Andrew Scheer. Here in Ontario, when Doug Ford was running in 2018, it was used against him. I'm not so sure Canadians just believe because you're a conservative or you're on the right side of the spectrum that you're ultimately Donald Trump, right? He's a very unique character. So I'm not buying all that just because they invoke MAGA or MAGA-style politics, it's going to rub off on Pierre and he's going to lose support. I ultimately think that the Conservatives are in the driver's seat in terms of public opinion. And my thing to what Dan said, if the Liberals are waiting for a 2024 election, if the Liberals are waiting to have all these ad buys, at a certain point, the sentiment for change will seep into Canadian mentality. And folks are not going to pay attention to the Liberals anymore. They're not going to buy what the Liberals are selling anymore. And so I think waiting might be to the detriment of the party. They need to get ahead of this and brand Pierre as a certain way and get that into the Canadian psyche that, this guy might be risky. He might be dangerous. If you wait too long, they're going to think we're done with the Liberals and done with Trudeau. And, Pierre's the only one that stands for change on the political spectrum. Let's just cast our ballots for him.
I've got 30 seconds left. Go ahead.
Well, I'll just say I think that Pierre Poilievre does a pretty good job defining himself as an import of MAGA-style politics. I think you'd have to squint pretty hard to see similarities between Doug Ford and his governing style and Pierre Poilievre. They're very different politicians, and it may not have been effective in the 2018 election to say Doug Ford was like Donald Trump. I think it'll be a lot easier to say someone who looks, acts, and behaves the way Pierre Poilievre does in our political environment is an import of a U.S.-style Republican.
Even though, as we watch the Republic, it might get crazier in the U.S. is what I'm saying, right? Even as Donald Trump goes further and further off to his own whatever.
His party voted against a deal with Ukraine, right? Which is very consistent.
But beyond that,
with the Trump.
yeah. No, there are other indicators, but it's
direct indicator of the exact same kind of politics that Republicans are carrying out at Congress right now here in our House.
They argue it's about the carbon tax, but I take your point.
But I think that's a stretch.
Okay, I got to go.
That's
Thanks,
lazy.
guys. Thanks to the front
comparison.
bench. Dan Moulton, Shakir Chambers, Laura Stone, and Kathleen Monk. We are back with today's takeaway in just a moment.